Yeah, and then so we'll look at who were the players. We'll look at that. And what were the issues, the geopolitics, the ideologies, the mindsets, the military strategies, tactics, and technologies that came to play for the, really, on the end, the first time in history. Map of the nations and the major battles, which might be kind of hard to really see, but because it's in German. But the coins, currencies, and stories of curves will be kind of towards the end, and then I draw some conclusions, and we'll give a quick summary. And as I go, here's some of the bibliography. So, some of the books that I bought this World War I book, and it came with this really neat poster. And this poster shows a gas mask and a filter, and it says smallpox respirator. So World War I was not only the first use of poison gas, it was the first use of biological weapons, chemical biological warfare. And it killed a lot of people, and it ruined a lot of lungs. Sad. There was really a lot of terribleness in World War I. So that book goes with that. I'm just going to leave that right there. Also, The Face of Battle by John Keegan. I read it a long time ago when I was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. It was mandatory reading. And right here at the cover, you have a skull with chainmail over it. Exactly how it was dug up in France. The Battle of Agincourt. First use of the longbow against an enemy. Henry III, I believe.
Henry V.
And then a same book with a different picture, more modern, skull with a helmet on it, found in the battlefield on the Somme. So this guy has a unique knack for looking at a battlefield, describing it, and you really feel like you're there, which is why it was mandatory reading. Not only was it accurate, super historian, but it was so well presented. And I will be quoting this book a couple times tonight. So giving credit where credit's due again, The World Crisis, 1911 to 1918. Churchill wrote this in sections. This was the last time he put it all together, so all the previous ones were obsolete. But Winston Churchill just has a brilliant mind and a brilliant way of describing things anyway. And he does a really good job with World War I. So I read this whole book up to here. But I did put other sections of it. It's big. The First World War, I bought it. I actually bought this in Summer Live from the library. This is really, really good book. It says, one of the first books that anyone should read in beginning to try to understand this war in this century, New York Times Review, and it's real good. Here we have Lawrence in Arabia. So Lawrence of Arabia was in Arabia, and we're not going to really even get to much of the Ottoman Empire fights against the English who were supporting the Arab revolt. The Arabs revolted against the Turks, or the Ottoman Empire, who were really suppressing them. They traded the Ottoman Empire for the English and the French, so they didn't do much better after that. World War I book. This is kind of really easy to read. It's good for young people like my son who doesn't like to read. I'm just kidding, he reads it. And finally, the Great War. This is from the library, as is this one, as is Lawrence of Arabia. So the library actually has a pretty good selection. Finally, up here at the end of the night, come on up and take a look at some of these coins. I will be passing coins around starting about right now. And also the Smithsonian Institute had a little display on World War I at this library a while back. And Kate Knapp, who runs events and really supports our club, saved them. And so they're all up here, which talk the different aspects and impacts of World War I, which were huge. World War I is really impacted greatly World War II, and it will also impact World War III, if it, God forbid, should ever happen. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. All right, that's the bibliography. Next slide, our timeline. I wish we could turn that way up, but that's okay. So everyone has a copy of this. I'm not going to belabor this. But really, World War I started long before 1914, which is when the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated. He was the heir to the throne. His father, Emperor Franz Joseph, had to stay on the throne a little longer because his son was assassinated by Serbian nationalists. But really, World War I was building before that. We'll see that as we get into this presentation. But there was a war before World War I. There's actually two. The First Balkan War in October of 1912. And talking about 1912, I'm going to hand around a couple of 1912 coins. And these will just go around and they'll come back to Lee. So we can start over here. 1912 rolled into April when the Titanic sank. It has nothing to do with World War I, at least I don't think it did. There could have been some German spies on board, or American ones. 1,500 drowned, and then President Woodrow Wilson was elected president, and Churchill was Lord of the Admiralty. So he's trying to strengthen the Royal Navy against a German buildup of their navy. So for the first time in modern history, the British Navy is being challenged. And that is one of the big reasons for World War I. Britain was okay with Germany doing some colonialism, Germany going here, Germany going there, Germany getting strong, but they were not okay with Germany having a navy that could defeat their navy. And so they went all out, as we'll see. 1913, the Second Balkan War. So in the First Balkan War, the Ottoman Empire shrinks. The Slavic nations really got back a lot of what the Ottoman Empire had taken, the Balkan area, like Bulgaria and countries like that. So, Second Balkan War, the Ottoman Empire gets a little bit back. Eastern Thrace would be modern Bulgaria, Romania. So they get a little bit of that back. But over 1 million Muslims die. Those were the Ottomans. And then the Jews living in the Ottoman Empire, who had kind of been protected a little bit by the Ottoman Empire, who wasn't so hardcore Islamic. They were a little bit more secular. They were allowing the Jews some protection, but in the midst of all this war, they suffered greatly in the Balkan Wars. And finally, 1914 is where the official start of World War I. And we go on across, after that assassination, Austria-Hungary invades Serbia, and then England declares war on Germany, and it just keeps going. And Russia decides that they're going to get in the, nobody trusted Germany. Germany had built up this huge military-industrial complex. They had the railroads, they had the transport, they had the best trained army, largest army in the world. And nobody wanted to trust them, for good reason. So then in 1915, a bunch of the major campaigns start. We have Gallipoli, which is a failed campaign by the Allies. Who were the Allies? England, France, Russia, Japan, later Italy, and you might think Portugal, Spain. There was also neutral countries like Spain, but mostly England, France, Russia, with some help from Japan, and then Italy. Whereas the Central Powers, the axis of World War II, the Central Powers of World War I, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and then Bulgaria and a few other smaller players. Yeah, so the Gallipoli campaign against the Ottoman Empire was a failure. The French and Russians and U.S. was not yet in the war. We joined late, and I'll talk about that later. But there were major land battles in France. The Germans' advance was halted. Trench warfare was set up, which was a very slow-moving fight. The western front lines were drawn, and the Royal Navy sinks some German ships in the Falkland Islands. So we're all the way down to South America. Truly a world war involving Europe, the high seas, the Middle East, Africa, and a little bit of South America right there. So the first use of poison gas on a large scale was by the Germans in France at a battle called Ypres, Y-P-R-E-S, which actually then just started both sides using it. Sinking of the Lusitania, most people have heard of that. It was a British flagship with 128 Americans on it who perished. And yet, still we didn't join the war. But that was a lot of Americans at that point wanted to join the war for the first time, because America did not want to join the war up to that. Italy joins in. Okay, German-Bulgarian forces invade, and then in 1916, genocide of Armenians by the Ottoman Empire, by the Turks. That's a real thing that has been suppressed by Turkey. They don't want to own up to that, but it really did happen. Armenian Christians and others were wiped out in large part in Armenia. And most importantly, Babe Ruth hits his first home run in the major
And
leagues.
what team was he playing for?
Boston.
Boston Red Sox.
In 1916, big land battles. These are the ones that we'll talk a little bit more about. Verdun, the Somme. These are major bloody battles involving the use of the tank, the first time for tank, plus that poison gas, plus there's naval battles going on, plus there's the machine gun, which was invented. Who invented the machine gun? Anybody know?
Browning.
John.
Hiram Maxim.
Hiram Maxim. What country did he belong to?
The United States of America.
What? That's right. He was a U.S. guy, and he sold. No, the U.S. wasn't interested in his machine guns, and he sold it to the Germans. Later, the U.S. was interested in bought it. In fact, a lot of people use the Maxim machine gun. There it is, and it was very effective in mowing down a lot of soldiers. Number one killer was artillery. Number two, probably machine guns. Number three, probably not poison gas, because poison gas did a lot of injury, but it didn't do that much killing. Probably just infantry shooting at infantry. But the exploding artillery was the biggest deadly thing. They had cannonballs that actually exploded. Horse-drawn ambulances. Horses were very big in World War I. People think tanks, but there's more horses than tanks. So this post is quite useful. Leave it there. The Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, which British, Lawrence of Arabia, supports. Well, who was Lawrence of Arabia? He wasn't a soldier. He was an archaeologist. But he's a natural-born leader, and he won the trust of the Arabs, and he was pretty smart, and he was able to use guerrilla warfare tactics against the Germans, the Ottoman Empire, and then later the Germans. And I forgot my bayonet. I have a German bayonet found in Jordan, which is obviously in use against the Arabs. And I forgot it at home. It's really beat up. It's ready to break in half, so it's probably a good thing I didn't bring it. Fighting there. That's all I'm really going to talk much about the Ottoman Empire. Just don't have time. T.E. Lawrence. And then Einstein finishes his theory of relativity in 1916. Next slide. Okay, and this is all on that handout. So 1917 comes along, and America finally declares war on Germany after Germany sinks a lot of our ships out in the Atlantic. For a while, Germany quit sinking ships in the Atlantic because we said we're going to come get you if you do. They moved to the Mediterranean, but then they came back because most of our ships were carrying supplies to England and France anyway. So they were targets. We entered the war. In 1918, President Wilson wrote his 14 points, and that 14 points had to do with peace after the war, how we would handle ourselves after the war by not being vengeful, by helping to build up the world again, by being good neighbors. Well, a lot of that never really happened, but it was good on paper. And other people, if you have any comments, please. So now the German army reaches the Marne River, and that is pretty far in, not real far into France, but it's far enough to where everyone's very concerned. And there, I'll talk a little bit about a hero who fought in the campaign of the Argonne and the Meuse, which is another river in France. But all these rivers in France were staging points for big, big trench warfare battles. They're very slow-moving, almost stationary dual fronts between the Central Powers and the Allies. And then in 1918, the Allies finally start making headways. Our counteroffensive are victorious. Ottoman Empire out of Damascus falls. and King Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary abdicates, so that's half of the Central Powers pretty much. And Turkey is granted armistice, they stop. Austria surrenders, and then the armistice, November, who knows when the date of the armistice? November 11, 1918. The armistice day. In fact, I'll pass around this coin, because this coin is a 100-year anniversary of Armistice Day. It's given to veterans. So we went through a whole bunch of time. I wanted to hand out one other handout. This is a Knights of the Templar from Utah, I believe, chapter. It says 1910, 1916. Well, the Templars were a Christian organization, and they were real knights back in the pre-Crusades, through the Crusades, all the way up to now. They were honorable guys, unlike some of the other people fighting in the Crusades. The Templars were honorable. They're also good soldiers. It's got a Knight Templar on a horse with a cross with rays coming off of it in the upper right, and then two swords, one with a K, one with a T, Knights Templar. So it's an organization to this very day, and it's a very interesting one, and I just bought that at All About Coins. Got a great deal on it.
Mark,
Yes.
since you're Air Force guy, why don't you say a little bit about flying in World War I? Is that
I will.
really critical? Okay.
I will, but it's mostly a ground war.
Well,
Airplanes were a novelty pretty much. Most of the fighting was on the ground or in the sea. A lot of it was in the sea.
and it wasn't even Air Force there.
But the way it was so exciting, of course I'm not talking about it. So then we have Mussolini, after the war, Treaty of Versailles really set up World War II. Churchill writes about it in his books. It treated the German people so bad. You know, they were the aggressors. They're the ones who pretty much started it. But they had nothing after World War I. And they tried to bleed them dry, take their land, treat the German people terribly, even in America. One of those posters talks about that. We were mad at the Germans, but we tried to bleed them instead of helping them out a little bit to become a civilized nation like the 14 points said we would. So America would not even sign the Treaty of Versailles because they saw that it was not fair to anybody. And they did separate peace treaties with Germany and Austria and Turkey. We did, America. So after the war, you got the Communist Party in Hungary. You got the Bolshevik Revolution was way back at the beginning, but now we have the Communist Party really growing. Stalin takes over the party in Russia. Now you have all this stuff happening, these far-right political movements. Hitler takes over the Nazi Party actually quite early, before all this, or right after all this, and starts setting up World War II, basically.
So the Treaty of Versailles blamed every death, every loss of property in Germany, and the oppression of that was so severe. It was added to World War II. It wasn't until 2011 that the last reparations were paid by Germany, which is
2011.
the children's
Germany
children's
paid
children
for
paying for the war.
Some of the money from after World War I, like 1920, this is all during World War I, these bills, and how you look at them. But after, there was so much inflation due to this economic turmoil that there were 100 million mark notes. You know, and it actually was happening before World War I too, but after World War I period of, and that's what set Hitler up. We're not going to get into that. We don't have time. Next slide. So a quick map with a few coins on the sides, of course, since we are a coin and history club. You got the Allies in this mustard color. So Great Britain, France, actually Portugal, North Africa, because they were what? Colonies of France and England. Italy joins a little later, and then we have Russia and Poland. Russia's kind of out for themselves. They wanted to get some of this land around the Balkans, just like they're doing today in Ukraine. and then Serbia, who actually kind of started the war by shooting the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, but they were on the Allied side too. It was really a war of geopolitics. Next slide. So, conflicting ideologies and mindsets. The rise of German imperialism pre-World War I definitely got the major powers, England and France, worried. So they were only unified in 1871. Up until then, Germany was a bunch of kingdoms. They were unified in 1871 and they became a republic, and they started building up their country economically, industrially, and pretty soon they're starting to pursue some colonialism. In Africa, France was pretty much divided up by France and England, a little bit of Portugal, but Germany had a place called German East Africa. And the most success the Germans had late in the war was there against the British. 2,000 Germans died, over 10,000 British died. Of course, there's African people fighting with them. And it's a story I can't get into, but it's fascinating. If you ever want to read a fascinating story, read about German East Africa. It actually made a coin, emergency coin. It's German East Africa. We'll pass that around. And coming back to Lee. And then, where are you going to put these things?
I don't know, I haven't seen anything
You
come back.
haven't seen any come back yet?
Keep them coming.
Keep them coming.
Right there.
Yeah, these are my storytelling points. I need to get to that. Also, before the war, it was a renaissance in art. In France, before World War I, artists galore. And I happened to find this medallion down at Freewater Coins, and it was signed in the bottom. You can barely see the signature by a very famous sculptor who made large-size sculpture. This could be a very valuable coin, but it's not because they made too many of them. But you can see the art. It's a fascinating pre-World War I coin. So I'll pass that around too.
Mark.
We'll come back to him.
Mark, are you going to get into the relationship that the leaders of the major powers were all cousins and?
Not very much, just because of time, but
Okay.
a little teeny bit, and then we can have a discussion afterwards and share, or even during. I'll pass around this penny because you can see Britannia is a symbol of Britain's naval strength. So you've got Britannia holding a trident in her hand, and behind the scene, behind the seat she's seated in, is a ship on the sea. So it's all about naval power. So naval power was very important. So when Germany starts building up their naval forces with battleships and U-boats, and they're also pushing that into colonialism. They want to take Morocco from France, and England really doesn't care if they do. But they're using this very pushy gunboat diplomacy down there. And I sold weapons to Morocco when I was with Boeing. This is a laser J-down with the Moroccan star. Morocco became quite an ally of the United States, still is. Even though they had the Barbary pirates at one time. That's a whole nother story we'll have to do in here with coins. But anyway, Germany's seeking a bigger share in Africa as well as in Europe, as well as in the Middle East. So they're getting the attention of the other great powers, and not in a good way. So they're shooting for that in Africa. Austria-Hungary annexes Bosnia. So the Central Powers are getting aggressive first. They are the aggressors in World War I militarily. You might say economically, Britain and France were. The new technology in World War I was super decisive in the terribleness of the war. So first use of steamboats in war, railroads were very important in getting stuff around. The Germans had quite a monopoly with railroads, even in Africa. Anti-malarial drugs. You're fighting in the tropics. These were new drugs that kept these soldiers from being wiped out by malaria. quinine and different things like that. The machine gun, as we know, an American invented it, a guy named Maxim. Poison gas, tanks, submarine, and large naval ships with big guns. They could really, for the first time, bring naval artillery to bear on the shore. Maybe not as accurately as they could in World War II, not nearly as accurately, but it was still a player. And then the strategy of alliances all over the world and military buildup, this continues along with the tactics. Tactics of surprise, trench warfare, blockades, aerial reconnaissance and bombardment. They even used balloons to bomb England along the coast. Zeppelins, you might remember Zeppelins. I actually found, I don't have these stamps because they're quite expensive, but the Zeppelin stamps commemorate these great airships that Germany was using to bomb. And we'll get into a little bit about the air stuff later. Then the Ottoman Empire strategy was to defend their shrinking empire with this large army and then help from Germany that had the real technological advantage going into World War I. All right. A couple more coins to pass around. I'm going to do here's a 1914 German Empire 10 Pfennig coin. Who was the German Empire? Anybody know? Emperor? Anybody know?
Kaiser Wilhelm II.
Kaiser Wilhelm II. Yeah. And so he was the decision maker for Germany, but he was highly influenced by his military generals. And he was quite aggressive. He wanted to see Germany make its mark on the world for the first time since becoming a republic. So pass that coin around. It's not big of a coin. And then I'm going to start passing around some of the coins that Lee made made inserts for.
Lee
So
made
here
coins.
again is a coin. It starts here. You might see these coins again, a few of these coins again later when we start going on the right. Here's a 1917 10 Pfennig and a German soldier, German soldier, Prussian soldier are synonymous. Even though the term Prussia is an older term, the German Empire. And here's a coin, it's a recruiting poster that you used. And this is a coin from Great Britain. It's a half penny from 1915. Kind of like that. So you had a 1919, and this is a 1915 one. And then we have a Canadian penny. Again, it's the English king, King George V, on the front. And on the back it says 1 cent with a wreath of maple leaf. Right? And I'll pass around one more of these coins right now because these are the coolest inserts. This is 1918 with another poster of a Canadian World War I soldier. And then when we start talking about the air war, I'll pass around a few other ones. Here's one of these large pennies. It says, "These women are doing their bit." That's a great one. And we'll pass those around. Next slide. Oh wait, you did. All right. So here we have we talked about the Central Powers strategies. Well, the Allied strategy was to counter the Central Powers' aggressiveness while keeping their colonialism alive and well. So they built up their naval forces even further. They maintained diplomatic ties to the colonies in Africa and around the world, India. And they also maintained ties with their European allies. Britain has always been very good at diplomacy and doing the hay back there. And then the other goal was to help the Arabs defeat kind of take the pressure off of Europe and help the Arabs fight the Ottomans and keep the Ottomans engaged instead of having them come into Europe. So the Arabs, along with British and other agents, assistants, kept the Ottomans very busy. And then finally defeat German forces on the Eastern Front, which is Russia's job, the Russian offensives on the Eastern Front. And they weren't all that successful at it, but successful enough to tie up the Germans over there. Again, new technology for the Allies, naval power was key, and then land and air weapons development and military tactics. The battle tank was first used and developed by England, by the British. A Spad fighter would go up against the Fokker D-7, so it was a biplane against a triplane, although Germany had biplanes as well. And also the aerial tactics, some were borrowed from Germany, and the lead German ace was Baron von Richthofen, who was the Red Baron. He developed tactics, so he could say if two airplanes are working in concert, using the right tactics, they have the firepower of four airplanes acting individually. And if four airplanes were working together, checking each other's six, using aerial tactics that Richthofen invented, they have the firepower of 8 airplanes doing their own thing. So this is the development of aerial tactics that I used in the F-15 many, many years later. So they were very bedrock tactics. Okay, after Germany first used poison gas, British and French soon followed, and then that's another technology used throughout the war. You know, they got in their lungs and it just rendered soldiers incapable of fighting, basically.
So Mark, the picture there, the shape of the bow is typical of the ships of the period in World War I. So what ship is that? Do you know what the picture came from?
I think it's a British ship. I can't remember which one. This is poison gas creating release. Trench warfare. British battle tank, but flying, what flag is that? France? I don't know. They exported it. And then this is, I believe, Eddie Rickenbacker, one of the guys, maybe Frank Bluth, from the Spad fighter. We'll talk a little bit about that next time. All right, major battles map. It's in German, but pictures tell 1,000 stories. Basically, trench warfare. So see that northeast corner of France, major battles going on in there. The Somme, Verdun, the Meuse, the Marne. Germany's trying to get all the way through to Paris, and thankfully, they're pretty much stopped. This is the cemetery at the Somme. So these are the Somme River, and no, this is Verdun, and that's the Somme. But kind of looked the same. Trench warfare looked the same. Wasn't pretty. And then over on the Eastern Front, with the Russians having the Eastern offensive, it kind of looks the same. Trench warfare, soldiers exhausted. They were using horses. They did have a battle tank down there. This is actually belongs more in the south, where the fight on the Italian mountains between Serbia-Hungary and Italy and Austria-Hungary was very, very, very tragic. I mean, people were freezing to death. More soldiers froze to death and were blown up by these giant mortar artillery than died in shooting or hand-to-hand combat by fire. It was brutal. And Hemingway, that's where he wrote. He wrote from Slovenia about that front down south, and it was just bloody and high altitude, brutal winter. And so Hemingway writes, this has to be the war to end all wars. It's that tragic. A lot of people died just in those mountains. 1 million people died in those mountains. Next slide. All right, we get to stories of courage using some of the coins and stuff, which you guys can come up and look at some of these. We'll keep passing some out, but these bills are interesting, and they do have dates on them, but you almost have to go blind finding the dates, which I did. They're on there, here's 1917, FUMF mark. FUMF is 5, right? 5 marks, yeah, there's a 5. And then 20 marks, 20. So you can actually learn German. This is 1950. And then they, instead of getting bigger and easier to read, they get smaller and harder to read. Took me like an hour to find the date on this one. It's at the very bottom, but I think it's 1918. There it is. 50 pfennigs. So now 50 pfennigs is a teeny bill. Before it was a big bill. So by the end of the war, Germany was, their economy was pretty much done. In fact, 50 pfennigs probably wouldn't buy you very much in 1918, I'd imagine. Another little teeny one, 50. That's 52, right? 50, and it's even smaller than the other one. 1918 again. And you're welcome to come up and handle all this stuff. 1919, after the war, in Poland was on the side of the Allies. They did a little better. They won some land. Their bills are bigger. It's just very simple logic. I mean, I don't know if it's accurate, but it is bigger. And this says 1,000 Polskis, whatever, zlotys, that's what it is. I actually have a set of gold coins from Poland that commemorate the first visit of a religious figure to a communist country. It's when Pope, what was the Polish Pope?
Jean Paul.
He visited when, just before Walsay democratized Poland, and that's an interesting story for another time.
So after the war, the Treaty of Paris apparently included the opportunity for certain areas to have plebiscite to determine whether they would remain in Germany or whether they would go to Poland or to Denmark, or some of the bordering territories. People actually had a plebiscite, which when I reflect about our politics of today, and you think of Ukraine, nobody's talking about a plebiscite to say Russia wants some of the territory, Ukraine wants it. I hear nothing about people talking about a plebiscite to say, where do the people?
Well, they're not talking about giving up any land yet either. So why do a plebiscite when you plan to occupy?
Yeah.
But eventually they will, I hope. This is a 1917 $1 bill with some pretty cool art on it from the United States. And it's funny, I had to pay like some money for this thing. But I can get like these things for much less money. So US money is always inflated because of collectors like us. We collect US stuff. Start collecting this stuff and maybe these prices will go down. Or I'm joking around a bit. But anyway, you have kind of US stuff along the bottom, except that's Italy. This is Russian, 20 kopecks. This is English penny with Britannia holding the trident. When the ship in the sea, you can't really see it much, but the sea's behind her and her shield is here. So everything is symbolic in coinage. Coinage is symbology on a micro scale. We've talked about that before in Dr. Lee and Ken's talk on obsolete currency, and they're taking major paintings and art and reducing it to bill size, small bills, even fractional currency, tiny stuff. Symbology's always been important. What's liberty doing? Liberty's walking towards the dawn of a new day, the sun. The winds at her back, all of those are bending forward. Her blouse is blowing forward. Symbology, look at the backside, you got the eagle standing on a pine log with a little sprig sapling coming out, represents resiliency, strength, growth, freedom. So symbology on coins is really neat. It helps tell the story, even of war, even of the reasons for going to war. So yeah, there was also a lot of tokens. I have a couple of medals. This was a World War I era pilot wing for the Army Air Service or Army Air Corps. By the way, when was the U.S. Air Force? When did the U.S. Air Force become the U.S. Air Force?
47.
47. Before that, they were the
Army Air
Army
Corps.
Air Corps. And even breaking that down, Army Air Service, the transport aircraft, Military Air Transport Command, now Military Airlift Command, now AMC, started off as the Air Ferry Command. That's when my dad was flying aircraft from factory to base, built P-39 Cobras, P-38 Lightnings. He's flying from factory to base as part of the Air Ferry Command. And then C-47s, finally he got into aeromedical evac in World War I. But these were all propeller airplanes in World War II, you know, because we weren't into the jet age yet. Certainly we're in the jet age in World War I, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next time. All right, so the Battle of the Somme. I want to read this quote. Again, it comes from that book I showed you, the skull in the helmet. The Face of Battle by John Keegan, who's a very highly decorated, awarded historian. He references an essay called The Beloved Captain by a guy named Donald Hankey, who writes about this captain. Hankey was killed in World War I, and also this captain was killed at the Battle of the Somme. But before that, Hankey writes about him. He says his confidence was infectious. His simplicity could not fail to be understood. Very soon, the awkward squad found themselves awkward no longer. Fact was, he had won his way into our affections. We loved him. If anyone had a sore foot, he would kneel down and inspect it. If a blister had to be lanced, he would very likely lance it himself. There was something almost religious about his care for our feet. It seemed to have a touch of the Christ about it. That's a picture of Hankey as a captain, The Face of Battle, yet another cover. This book was widely published, many editions. A horse-drawn carriage, possibly an ambulance, probably not. And then soldiers in the trenches, maybe crossing from one trench across no man's land to try to take some ground back, get some ground. Next slide. Sergeant Alvin York, another hero. So I want these stories of courage. I wish I could just talk about these, but Sergeant Alvin York was actually a Christian pacifist. He's a World War II hero. He grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Pall Mall, Tennessee. He probably shot squirrels as a kid and other animals to help feed the family. His dad died fairly young. He helped his mom. He was a brawler and a drinker until he met Christ. He changed his ways. So when he gave his life to God in 1914, this is before the U.S. had entered World War I, right? 1970. He started really growing in his love for God. And he didn't want to fight. He didn't want to kill anybody. So that word pacifist is what it means. You are determined not to kill anybody, not to take life. However, he was drafted as an infantryman. He told them, I don't want to fight. But then they said, well, go think about this because we really need you. And the Germans are killing all these innocent people. And they were. And so he did. He went up to the hills. It was called the Yellow Door. It looked like a yellow door rock. And the way they say it back in Tennessee is Yellow Dar. So he went up to the Yellow Dar and he prayed and he said, okay. God gave him permission in his heart to go into World War I. Once he did, he was fearless. He was in the offensive on the Argonne-Meuse offensive in France, one of those rivers areas, Argonne Forest, which runs into Belgium, and then the Meuse River. And they had to take a hill. He's a corporal now. And this German position is heavily defended by machine gun nests and soldiers, and they had time, this is their land, to really prepare their battlefield, to defend their homeland. Actually, it wasn't quite their homeland because they had invaded France, but they knew it very well. And they had, these guys were real professional soldiers. The US guys, a lot of them are real rookies. But York sees a way around and he leads the charge. Actually, his lieutenant was killed and then his sergeant was killed. So it was him. He leads this, he only is down to 7 guys. Anyway, he kills 25 Germans, 28 bullets, 25 plus Germans. And he captures 132 of them because they didn't want to die anymore because he wasn't missing. So the German leader said, English? He goes, no, American. And the guy says, good Lord. And he says, I'll surrender my men if you promise to quit killing them. So this general says, finally, how did you do it? And York goes, well, it wasn't me. It was a higher power, not me, that enabled this whole thing to happen. Great book, and he several books written about Sergeant York, and a movie with Gary Cooper. But that's what he said. He said, higher power helps find men, and small team to kill and capture those German soldiers. So 1919, after the war, he's awarded the Medal of Honor. They really looked at what happened because it was almost unbelievable. So they went back, they studied it, they talked to witnesses. Yep, that's what happened. And he gets the Medal of Honor. So he also starts a Bible school and he starts a program for youth, not just in his town, but throughout Tennessee and the South. So he had a very great life. He married a gal and they had kids. There's a picture of him holding his kid. He wouldn't accept money for speaking engagements. He accepted money only for the school and the youth programs because he didn't. That would have been a conflict with his values. Yeah, Argonne Forest doesn't really show the Meuse River. You can see it's a. He was in an area where all these countries came together. There's the Medal of Honor. There's the next slide. Okay, a few more stories, and we'll wrap it up. Manfred von Richthofen, he really was a baron by birth, right? He was a smart guy, a fantastic pilot. He was a leading German Luftwaffe, or Air Force ace. Far more kills than Rickenbacker, who was the leading U.S. ace, or any British ace. His aerial tactics, again, adopted by both Allied and Central Power Air Forces. Up to this very day, his tactics are used, modified a little bit. He did die in battle. He died in an air battle. Eddie Rickenbacker, he was the leader of the Hat in the Ring Squadron. I think it's the 207 Aero Squadron, based in France. It was not the Lafayette Escadrille, which the movie Flyboys made famous. It was another unit in France. There was several hundred American pilots serving in France, flying French airplanes and British airplanes. The Newport, French, and the Spad, British. We didn't have airplanes. We had the Curtiss Jenny, used for airmail. So we had to borrow airplanes. But Rickenbacker learned to race cars. Another car racer, I think Glenn Curtiss, who was an aircraft builder, took him for his first flight, and then another guy trained him. He was a natural. And so that's why he became America's leading ace, at least 27 confirmed kills. After that, he taught a lot of people who flew for the airlines. He had a very productive life, married a gal, and when he died, she took her life. She couldn't.
Eddie Rickenbacker, at some point after the war, bought the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. So he owned the Speedway. During World War II, they didn't run any races and kind of went bankrupt. And he sold it in 1946.
He's also had something to do with American Airlines.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I didn't know that. So some of my heroes were also the chaplains, medics, and nurses in World War II. So, these are the ones who are dodging bullets without being able to shoot back. They're out there administering last rites, saving people. not only in the trenches and on the front, but also back in the makeshift hospitals and then the other hospitals. So there are so many stories. I did about 100 hours, at least, researching this. There's no way I can even touch on the 10th of those stories, but they're fascinating. So that spiritual, physical support was really, really important. And there's names, but I don't think they want us to use the names. Next slide. Okay, a few conclusions. So World War I was the first modern global war between great powers. There's the Allies, there's the Central Powers. It's fueled by Allied nationalism and colonialism and German global expansion, which they had that German name, which I can't remember. And then the aggression of Germany. They did it like Germans do things, aggressively. They wanted their share in the world as a republic, but the way they went about it alarmed everybody. So it was fought in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, the high seas, and like I said, even in the Falkland Islands. It was the first wartime use of poison gas, tanks, machine guns, long-range artillery, some of it exploding, trench warfare, balloons, and aircraft. Over 9 million soldiers, 13 million civilians died. Terrible injuries due to all these new weapons and bombs left people maimed for life. But through it all, through all the terribleness, there was these numerous stories of faith and courage. Next slide. Probably went over, sorry. Question time. We'll give away a few coins. Thanks, Josh. Turn
So
those
thank
lights
you,
on.
Mark, for bringing